Hey guys, Rafe here from Evolve and Play. Today I'm here with Forencich from Exuberant Animal. Frank is one of the really kind of early thinkers on applying the paleo idea to movement practice. One of the early thinkers on kind of connecting the idea of physical culture with broader concepts in evolution, in neurobiology, in a lot of really interesting kind of connections to how the body should move. I ran into Frank's work about 8 years ago. He and I were both living in Seattle at the time. We got to have dinner a few times, helped him organize an event, and found a lot of inspiration in his work at the time, but we kind of drifted apart, and I hadn't really been looking at it as much until a friend of ours, Jason C. Brown, started sharing his work with me again. And it was amazing because over those 8 years, I had evolved a lot of similar perspectives to the stuff that I saw Frank kind of saying before maybe anybody else that I could find around that time. So Frank's just here in Leavenworth. It's a beautiful snowy day, and I thought it'd be great to kind of come up and have a conversation with Frank about movement and the growth of the movement world, and how this broader evolutionary perspective and this play perspective can kind of help people really address that in their lives in a much more powerful way. So Frank, thanks for being here.
Great to be here.
Yeah. So first question I like to ask people is kind of with all these ideas that you've come to, what is the kind of the root of your movement practice right now? What is it that you're really excited about with your movement?
What really turns me on right now is public health, believe it or not.
Okay.
Because what has, I think a lot of athletes go through this growth and development phase where they train really hard and get their movement working for them and really enjoy the process. And eventually you succeed. I mean, you get the movement skills that you want to get, and then you start to look around at the world and you start to see that a lot of people aren't as fortunate as we are. And it's very easy to see the decay of public health and to see the problems in the world with the human body. And that leads to this whole other exploration of why did this happen and why are people's bodies suffering so much? And that is just fascinating to me, because now you start to, it's not just about movement anymore. Now it's about things like culture, and it's about history, and it's even about things like policy. You know, what are we going to do to regain our health as a people? So that's what really intrigues me right now, but I'm still interested. I still love to move, and I still enjoy climbing and martial arts and play with other people and these kind of things. So I'd like to have my hand in all of it.
That's great. And that actually kind of ties right into a really core piece of both of our work, that is this idea of play. Because why do we have a culture that's so physically decayed? The thing that I'm always thinking about is, where's the motivation?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Why do kids inherently are motivated to move and play? What happened to our physical culture? So I'm curious to hear you kind of really talk about how did we lose that, and what can we do to kind of bring that back?
Right. Well, part of the problem, and a lot of writers on the human body and human history have talked about this idea that we're predisposed to sloth. We're predisposed to relax. That would have been our life on the grassland, on the Savannah was really difficult, and we are predisposed to take it easy whenever possible. So it's almost like we're programmed to rest, and that's part of it. But beyond that, and you bring up children, I think part of it's really cultural right now, this professionalization of youth sports that we see everywhere now, where we're starting kids really young in movement specialties that take them right out of play. We start training them with really highly disciplined procedures for sets and reps and doing movements in a particular way. So now they become adept at a movement specialty, but they really want to play. And this is a common complaint in youth sports, a common complaint of the children. They say, we want to play. That's the thing we want most. And we take that away from them because we want to make children's sports like the pros, and that's a big mistake. So that's one of our problems.
Yeah, it's interesting. I tend to think of the play drive as an appetite for movement, and that it's something that we all actually have. We all inherently have an appetite to move, and when we're regularly exposed to move, we recognize the nutrition from different types of movement. In the same way that when we're regularly exposed to a kind of a broad variety of food, we recognize, oh, my body needs green vegetables right now, my body needs this. And kind of my perception is that we, as a culture, we have taught people not to move. And then we've taught them to kind of try to get all of that movement nutrition in a really limited way.
Right.
And so, yeah, we're programmed to rest, but like animals that are rested and well fed play, because that's how they develop skills, that's how they hone themselves to be able to, move well.
Right.
So, what do you see as the way that we as a culture can kind of reframe the way that we think about movement so that we can start harvesting that motivation and give people this freedom to play?
Well, I think something that we're really going to dive into here is this distinction between romantic and classical. And the short answer here is that I think we as a culture now are overboard with classical forms of education where it's all about measurement and units and hierarchy and precision and discipline of delivering content and trying to achieve some kind of result. And I think that we need perhaps to go to more of an experiential or a romantic point of view on the body and just let's focus on the experience and worry less about the achievement that we're trying to crank out at the other end. And if we focus on a good quality achievement, not just for kids, but for us too, then we're going to liberate some of that play drive. Say, hey, let's have a good experience. Let's not worry about tomorrow so much.
It's such a powerful thing because we have a greater power to measure things than we've ever had. And in trying to get any goal, being able to set up these measurements and these tools can help us get there. But so often it seems to me that we find that the goal was not actually the reason that we started the journey in the first place. And if we get lost in the goal, then we're maybe missing the whole point.
Right. And I think things like the Fitbit and all the fitness trackers, that kind of thing, I personally don't find that to be attractive. I think it's a distraction and it takes us away from the experience of moving our bodies and we become more like data collectors. And that's part of the problem as well.
This focus on goals and on like achievement, it can be powerful, but at the same time, I think it's very limiting to people because if you say everybody who's gonna run, everybody should run, we're all gonna run, and now we're gonna measure who wins every time.
Right.
Well, you have a small group of people who end up winning, and a lot of people who end up not enjoying running nearly as much.
Right.
And that's kind of seeped into the whole culture of the movement, it seems like to me. A lot of people see my videos, and they say, well, I could never do that, or I'll never reach that level, or I'm 25, or I'm 35, or I'm 18, and I feel like I'm too old to kind of take on.
Right.
It's crazy how young people think they're too old in our culture to move. And I'm always like, well, maybe you won't ever jump from one waterfall to another. And you know what? You can have an immensely valuable journey. You can have a more valuable journey without ever achieving that, because it's not about. There's a saying in mountain climbing: it's not what the man does to the mountain; it's what the mountain does to the man.
That's good.
And so, yeah, I think it's a really interesting point about we need to kind of get involved in give people permission to focus on the joy in the moment.
Right. And I think that really means de-emphasizing competition. Competition is such a big feature of the white man's culture. And we find ways to introduce competition into almost everything that we do now. And that produces some incredible achievements, but it also extracts a big cost. And I hate to see it overdone.
Yeah.
It has its place, but...
Yeah, the classical... So can you just explain what classical versus romantic approach is a little
Right,
bit?
this is a distinction from, well, a little bit of background. I went to teacher education school, and I found it to be extremely frustrating because they gave us this incredible hodgepodge of ideas about how to become educated or how to teach something. And I found it just tremendously frustrating. So I did a lot of background work, and I happened across a short essay by Alfred North Whitehead, philosopher, mathematician. And he looked at education and he said, look, there's advocates for freedom, there's advocates for discipline, and they're always fighting with each other. Can't we have a system that oscillates between the two? And now we have two poles, one where there's freedom, the other where there's discipline, and each one has its place. So you have a rhythm where you have a phase or a period of highly disciplined training that gives way now to a romantic experience and then back into a disciplined phase. And so what he describes, and it's really interesting to read this because it's called the Rhythmic Claims of Freedom and Discipline. And he sounds like a Taoist in there because he's talking about rhythm and oscillation, and it's great. So, and it's a way to have it both ways. Yeah. And this is something that we don't see. The typical education process doesn't include both of these. It's usually either some sort of hardcore discipline training or some free-for-all where the participants are encouraged to do whatever they want. And that's okay too, but the best result comes in putting them together. It's, for my money, that's the future. That's the way to go, is teach teachers how to deliver both kinds of experience to people.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a creative writing class in college, and we had this completely romantic approach. Like, everybody can write, all writing is good, just write lots of pages. Right. And at the end of it, I didn't feel like I learned anything. And, you know, I've tended to go the opposite way, to be very kind of scientific and analytical in the way that I wanted to approach training. And there's been a lot of value, a lot of progression within that. But what I found is that, you know, there's a point at which the motivation tends to go away.
Right.
And in teaching my students, what I found is as I've kind of pulled back some of the technical aspects, leaving enough structure there, but giving them a lot more room to kind of fill out the scaffolding.
Right.
The progression and the engagement is just grown by leaps and bounds.
Right.
And within my personal practice, I find there's this really interesting oscillation where I'll go through periods. I went, when I first started evolving play, I went like, I'm just going to see what play does for me. I'm just going to go outside every day and find the way that I want to move. And I made a lot of progress for a while, and then I hit a wall. And I was like, my body needs this discipline aspect. So I've been kind of trying to find that wave.
Right.
Between this this aspect of a classical approach and a romantic approach. Or, you know, I was having a conversation in the last podcast with Kelley started. We talked about this idea of a formal movement language versus moving in nature and being adaptive in your movement, and how they can feed each other.
Right.
And so I wanted to kind of bring that idea back around to you and say, like, how do we use discipline to kind of feed us the tools that we need to be able to play at a very high level? Right. And then bring enough play in so that we can refuel ourselves and have that motivation to stay on the path. Right.
Well, I was fortunate. I had a martial art teacher who I thought struck a really nice balance with this, because the figure everybody's talking about now is that, you know, it's 10,000 hours to achieve mastery in any discipline, whatever it is. And, you know, that's roughly the time to get a black belt, you might say. And he was really quite good because there were times and circumstances where he was a hardcore disciplinarian. So you stand here, you do this kick, you do this punch, you do it exactly the way I'm telling you. But he also allowed for slack in the system. There were times during the training week and the training month where we could just do this playful sparring, and it was just whatever you want to do, that's okay. And the sort of paradox here is that the more discipline you bring, the more fun you can have. Once you set up the boundaries and tell people to play within those boundaries, beautiful things start to happen. The problem is if you don't have any boundaries, now the play field is too wide and people don't really know what to do. And it's the same thing in music instruction too. If you let people have the entire fretboard or the entire keyboard and tell them just to play, it's too big, it's too much. So instead you give them one chord or one scale, one note even. You just play it. What can you get out of that small, limited thing? And then the teacher opens up the boundaries a little bit more.
Yeah, that's an idea I really like of how we create constraints with this an amount of freedom inside them that kind of optimizes the creativity of the learner at a given point.
And this comes up in a really interesting place. I read a book called Story by Robert McKee, and he's a screenwriter in Hollywood, and he actually teaches screenwriters. And this is a point he hammers over and again, is this idea of creative limitation. He says, artists want to be free, but that freedom, if it's too much, then the artist will not produce a great work. There's got to be creative limitations, and that forces the artist to dig a little bit deeper into their capability. And that's where this whole idea of neuroplasticity comes in too, because limitation, now you're asking the nervous system for more. And you play to discover what that more is. So those two ideas really fit together nice.
Freedom and limitation, in a sense, only exist because of each other. Right? Like this Taoist dualism, right? That the inverse of two things can only exist because two inverses rely on each other.
Right.
And this is a powerful idea to me because I think there's this tendency within Western culture to be so focused on freedom and so individualized that we end up with this really bizarre idea almost of the individual being able to act completely separate from other influences as the kind of epitome of freedom.
Right.
And to me that sounds like sociopathy.
Right.
Like, to me, a grown, cultivated self, yes, you create potential for power and potential to do things, but it's always wrapped in a social web. And you never have complete freedom because you're always having to think about, if you're pulling oil out of the ground, is it affecting the water?
Right.
If you're practicing singing in the middle of the night, is it affecting the neighbors? And this web of constraints with the growth of freedoms, I think, it's such a powerful idea, not just in moving, but in really like the art of living.
Yeah, the thing I would add there is that this idea, this really strong emphasis on freedom that's so much a part of American culture, that's really unusual in the context of human history and human cultures. Most indigenous native cultures have always talked about continuity and connection and relationship, and you won't hear those cultures talk very much about freedom at all, because in order to survive in a outdoor setting, you have to have a lot of connection to your tribe and to the natural world, and you don't hear them talk about freedom very much.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. It is I think that in the West there's some really tremendous value that comes from that individualization and that freedom, but we don't necessarily see the costs.
Right.
And and that's important. You know, that's kind of I think, a really interesting aspect of this whole mismatch conversation.
Mm-hmm.
When I think about that, you know, I like to emphasize that we live in the most affluent period in history. We have, you know, my phone gives me powers of communication, powers of knowledge attainment, powers of mapping
Mm-hmm.
that have never existed in human history. I'm
Right.
a magician by most
wizard.
historical
Yeah.
periods. And in a lot of ways, that's great. And, you know, I'm having this conversation with you because of someone posting your stuff on the internet.
Right.
I have friends all over the world. And yet, we're so fast and we're adopting things so quickly that we're not recognizing the costs.
Right.
And we live in this alien environment.
Right.
You have this idea that you're talking about of the long body, the
Mm-hmm.
fact that we have this great continuity with the past, with the world around us, with the people around us.
Right.
And that when we change things really fast, it's easy for that to get lost.
Right.
So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, just the long body is a Native American idea, but a similar idea shows up all across Native Indigenous cultures. And the idea being that the boundary of the body is not the skin. The body actually extends out into the world and includes your habitat and your tribe. And these are your life support systems. And the key word there is continuity, because the connection between our bodies and our habitat, our bodies and our tribe, it's not just mystical, and it's not just something that occurs in the imagination. It's an actual physical reality. And when it ranges from things like circadian rhythm and the way the light impacts our physiology and resynchronizes our physiology every day, to the way that other people's bodies influence us and our emotions and our through the mirror neuron system. The continuities are astonishing. And to talk about people as individuals is starting to look really kind of distorted, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So it's also really interesting because it's a Native American idea, but it's also validated by modern science. So this word continuity shows up everywhere now. It shows up in Native culture, but it shows up in science too. And it's something we're going to have to come to grips with pretty soon.
Yeah, I think it's part of the Western tradition too. Like if you think about philosophy has been interrogating the concept of the self for a really long time. When you dig down into it, a self is actually a difficult thing to define, and there has been a dialectic about that for a really long time.
Right.
And you know, various theological traditions are obviously talking about being one with God, and everyone is to some degree one with God. You have certainly the idea of duty to the church, duty to the family, duty to the nation, or whatever it is. So I think there is that this concept really throughout the world. Though I agree that we live in the most individualized world ever.
Right. And the flip side of this long body orientation is what I call the short body orientation. And you can see this all around. So we practice short fitness, short medicine. Both of these are similar, where we take the body in isolation and attempt to make it better. We attempt to either increase its athletic performance or its health. And we don't ask questions about habitat and tribe. You go to the doctor isn't going to ask you about your habitat, typically. It's not going to ask you very much, if at all, about your social circumstances. And this is short body health, short body medicine, and we do short body training with a lot of people too. It's like we just give them a bunch of sets and reps to do and forget about the context. So
yeah.
We have a context shortage in our world.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting connection back to what we're talking about with the early specialization in sports. it's one of the central principles of kind of Western physical culture is this idea of specific adaptation to impose demand. So if you want your child to be a world-class soccer player, then they got to play soccer. That seems obvious, but what we're missing is sort of the context of what all those other people who became world-class soccer players had. The body is not kind of a one output thing, and if you try to make it a one output thing, we tend to break. So I think it's an interesting idea. Again, specialization and not seeing this broader context of you have to be a human first. Right.
And you go back to the original forms of human movement, which would be gathering first, and then hunting, and then dancing. Those are not really specializations. Hunting, perhaps, but even there, most hunters were opportunists. You go out on the grassland, and you're going to hunt whatever animal happens to be in season or happens to be coming through your habitat. And you're probably not going to specialize in any one hunting form, any one hunting movement. And then the same thing with dancing. Early dance, I'm sure, was you would mimic certain animals, but you would gesture and try and communicate, use that gesture to communicate. So specialization is kind of a recent thing.
Yeah, it's been a powerful thing for us.
Yes.
I think it's kind of interesting because, there's a debate right now about the people in the Americas. So we have this Clovis model of the people in the Americas, where basically these megafauna hunters through big spears kind of came through about 13,000 years ago. And we're seeing more and more information now that there was someone here before that. And what it looks like is that there was a people who had a technology around gathering marine animals, hunting and gathering marine resources. And what's interesting is they seem to have not kind of picked up the megafauna hunting. And then they seem to have been possibly replaced by the people who came as megafauners. So there is this tendency within human cultures to kind of end up focused on a kind of individual skill set. Even in animals, we can see this. Like there are lion prides that are specialists on elephants, or lion prides that are specialists on wildebeests, orca whales. Some orcas are really big on salmon, some orca whales are really big on something else.
Right.
So there is that element that has been there, but the rise of modern technology really is the story of specializing in more and more tight spaces. I give this analogy sometimes that we have a culture that has more global knowledge than ever, but the width of the knowledge of the individual has been narrowed beyond any reasonable amount.
Yeah. Garrison Keillor makes that point. He says nobody knows how to do anything anymore, like a farmer would, because now we have such tight specializations.
Yeah, I love this term that's come kind of within the fitness world, I guess now, movement culture, right? Where we think about our movement practices as a culture, as a tradition, and to me it connects to this broader idea of culture, right? When traditionally there are martial arts in every culture, there are dance practices in every culture, and everybody participated in these, right? Now most people participate in no physical activity, so in a sense they've lost their movement culture.
Right.
And I think you can go down the list and find this over and over again. Before we had radios, people sang and played instruments.
Right.
So how many people are carriers of musical culture now?
Only the specialists.
Yeah. How many people can find a medicinal plant, a plant that you can eat? So we were talking about this idea of movement culture as kind of a component of somebody's broader culture and how people are the bearers of less and less of the overall culture. And I'm curious about your observations of this and how you think that affects people.
Well, I think in a lot of ways our culture systematically disempowers people, because when all you've got is one little specialization, you're incredibly vulnerable. And especially if that doesn't feed your health and feed your body in some way. I spent a lot of time studying stress, and one thing that comes up over and over again is this idea of control, the power of control. If you have some sense of control over your circumstances, then your stress will decline, obviously. And what's one of the best ways to get a sense of control? It's to move your body. And that's what I think is really going on with exercise, is that people benefit from exercise, not so much because of the exercise, but the fact that they've gained a sense of control. That's the most intimate kind of control you can have, is the ability to move your body as you choose, as you see fit. And you go to the gym or you go outdoors or you go play. Now all of a sudden you feel better because you are empowered, you are in control of your own life, your own circumstances. And by living in a culture that doesn't honor the body, we disempower people in a big way.
Yeah, it's interesting. We touched on this idea earlier that we live in a time of unmatched affluence, right? We live in a time where people have far less risk of disease, far less risk of murder, far less risk of violence, and yet we also live in a time where people have epidemics of anxiety and depression.
Right.
It's I'm getting a little mystical here, but I almost feel like there's a deep-seated, like human beings evolved in a context where they needed these broad scales of competence for a really long time, and I think that we inherently start feeling that we're missing something.
Yes.
If you can't make a fire, if you can't hunt, if you can't gather, if you can't build anything, like you're an incredibly vulnerable thing when you take away the broader culture.
Right.
I think that's part of it, and what I'm more confident about is just that people don't have sources of self-worth. Right? If you were a great singer in a tribe, that was a source of self-worth.
Right.
If you were a good hunter, if you were a good forager, if you know how to find this thing, if you were the great mushroom finder, all these things became places that somebody could kind of harvest a sense of self-worth. And as we become more and more specialized, there's fewer things that we can kind of call our own and can draw value from.
Right.
So I think that we live in this culture where people talk a lot about the value of self-esteem, but we don't have a plan right now to develop selves that are worth esteeming.
Right, and it would help if we started with the body, and started with movement.
Yeah.
That's, no matter how you slice it, that's what we need to get back to. And that's core to our experience.
Yeah, and that's why my work, involved in play. I call the slogan for my brand is "Move Like a Human," because I think that it's probably the easiest place to start reclaiming this culture, this humanness.
Right.
I know your recent book, the Beautiful Practice, kind of posits the same thing. There's all these cultural practices that are really valuable, but the root starts in the body and cultivating the body.
Right.
So would you talk a little bit more about kind of why you think that's the best place to start?
Well, because it's ancient, because it's so old, and things that are old tend to be powerful. The common time frame that people work with here, they say, well, the human species is 200,000 years old, roughly 250,000 years old, which seems like a long time, but it's really not, because our bodies are actually far, far older than that. And it depends where you draw the line, but millions of years, certainly, tens of millions of years. Mammals, 120 million years. Vertebrates, 500 million years. So by moving and by being physical, we become continuous with this ancient history, something that is far more powerful than we realize, and it's far more powerful than just the glossy magazine exercise stuff. No, this is substantial. This is ancient. This is really primal, and it's not just about looking good, and it's not just about, even in some ways it's more important even than health. You know, this is connecting to the ancient biosphere, and nothing else can do it except moving our bodies.
Yeah, I mentioned to you off camera before we started this interview that my friend Simon Thacker has a blog called Ancestral Movement. He really works on this idea of kind of discovering the inner ancestor.
Right.
Whether that ancestor is the inner worm, the inner fish, the inner ape, all these things, we have characteristics that weren't changed. They developed first, and then they've been conserved by evolution because they work.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We're a big tube.
Right.
We move around with our face first because that worked as worms.
Right.
Our spines move in certain ways because those are the initial characteristics of chordates. I think this is a really interesting idea, and I really, I remember when we first encountered Exuberant Animal 8 years ago, you had this beautiful mandala of health, right? We took the idea of mind, body, and spirit and expanded it to talk about the land and the ancestors.
Right.
And so in this sense, when we return to the trees, we're in a way giving respect to the monkeys as our ancestors,
right.
the apes as our ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
When we practice moving around on the ground, we're going back to being quadrupedal animals.
Right.
Squirming on the ground, we're going back to being these things. So, I wanted to just kind of get you to expand on this idea of why is a sense of our ancestry an important component of our health?
Well, just look at the nervous system, and you don't even have to know that much about the nervous system to realize that a very simple ancient nervous system would have had motor commands, motor pathways, but those pathways would only be useful if there was some sort of sensation coming back. So it's a cybernetic system, but it's a conversational system, and that goes back hundreds of millions of years. So when we move our bodies, especially outdoors in nature, we're setting up this natural conversation between habitat and nervous system that it's call and response, and it makes the nervous system work in the context that it worked in for millions of years. And that is why that kind of experience is so powerful. We're reenacting things that we've done for a very long time.
Yeah. And when I teach people, I take them into the trees, and I get them in the trees, and I say, you have binocular vision because your ancestors came from the trees.
Right.
You have grasping hands because your ancestors came from the trees. The origination of a shoulder that has a full range of motion is from animals that hung from tree limbs.
Right.
That's why we have a flat chest. That's why we have upright torso orientation. So we rediscover the human body in a lot of ways when we just climb a tree.
The other element there is the fact that, and a lot of people don't realize this, the muscular system is a sensory system, because embedded in all the muscles and the tendons and the ligaments are mechanoreceptors. So every time you move your body, you're flooding sensation back into the nervous system, which gives us a sense of identity and a sense of who we are in the world, where we are in the world. These are really fundamental things. In contrast, what happens when people are sedentary in the modern world, they suffer what you might call a sensation deficit. they're not getting that sensation anymore. And lo and behold, they start to feel anxious. They start to feel unhappy and really kind of jittery because they're kind of living in space. That's what it feels like when you're sedentary.
Yeah. I was a really active kid. I grew up in a hippie community out in the woods. I was homeschooled after 3rd grade, so I had a lot of time to kind of just move around the woods. But what happened is when my tribe broke down, and all my friends stopped being available because they were getting busy with middle school,
right,
and people weren't there to play and move with, I became really sedentary, and I sat on my computer all the time and read, and I literally had this feeling of like being just disconnected from my body and realizing how trapped inside my own head I was.
Right, right.
And that's when I kind of came back to movement practice and started picking up gymnastics and martial arts and basketball.
Right.
So I think that's a really powerful concept that we need this. If you, I'm sure I've talked about this before, but babies, if they're not touched, they'll die.
Right.
We are shaped literally by the things around us, by touch. Katie Bowman talks about the fact that every cell in the body responds to the way that it's loaded. So if you're not experiencing the types of loading in the tissues that was characteristic of the ancestral environment, so that means walking barefoot over rough ground, that means sitting, standing, lying down on a variety of surfaces, then you're not feeding those cells what they have needed to function optimally. You're not moving your lymph around. You're not creating the structural integrity of the individual cell. And reading your book, your work, it's interesting because you're kind of finding the same idea. Touch is important, tactile sensation is important, but more from a neurological perspective. So she's saying that the cell needs it to be healthy, to be strong, to build its cytoskeleton.
Right.
But also we need it because the brain isn't able to even feed itself without
Gotta have that touch, and that touch comes either from people or from the habitat or from motion.
Yeah.
It's all forms of touch. And this is where I think the medical community has really fallen short, because people go in to see a physician, and depending on which survey you read, doctors really don't ask about exercise or movement very much. And there was a report just this week from NPR about back pain, and a big meta study of many studies. They discovered that exercise is the best treatment for back pain. And also they discovered that doctors rarely ask or prescribe exercise for back pain. And I think it's a sensory thing. I think that's why exercise works, is because you develop more sensation in your torso, and now all of a sudden, wow, your body feels a lot more, there's a lot more information to work with.
And motor maps are being refined.
Yeah, so that I think is the future, is healing ourselves through movement and use of the body.
Yeah, another friend of mine who I want to introduce you to is Todd Hargrove, and his work is a lot about how pain is something that happens in the brain,
right?
Not something that's local to the tissues. And it's about how it's interpreted.
Right.
And a lot of issues with pain that we have are because the body's not getting the information from the cells in the local tissues in a way that is coherent. So the map breaks down when it's not used. So if we sit in a chair all day and our back only has one position, that's a back that's not feeding a ton of information to the nervous system.
Right.
It develops a poor connection and potentially becomes a source of pain.
Right. Yeah, it's all cybernetics. We hear this term cyborg.
Yeah.
And we think robot, but really we're all cyborgs. We're cybernetic organisms, and we depend on that feedback to come into the nervous system, so we'll have something to work with.
Yeah, we have. The self cannot exist without the external world.
Right.
It has to be informed.
Right, and that's what we're trying to do in this modern technological world, is we're trying to create autonomous organisms. And this whole idea of getting in a spacecraft and going to Mars, I find just completely intolerable. I mean, there are people signing up to do that.
Yeah.
And I think of that as a really scary proposition, to be lost in space like that.
That's interesting. One of my good friends is a person who's like super into that idea, and it's strange to me because I wouldn't want to be on a spaceship to Mars,
Right?
Because I feel like we're still just learning how to live on Earth,
Right.
Like we're we talk about all the evolutionary mismatch problems.
Mm-hmm.
Like, one question I've thought about Mars is like, so Mars has 0.37 gravity. How does a pregnancy work? Right? How do all these human systems work? Those systems are adapted through billions of years to life here on Earth. On the other side, like from an evolutionary standpoint too, it's very exciting because a planet is a really vulnerable thing. If there are more planets that humans live on, then we are more robust. But yeah, I'm more like you. I lean more towards like let's approach these things with some caution and some respect for the fact that we are Earthlings.
Yeah,
and it's not going to be so easy to become anything else.
Let's solve this mismatch first.
Yeah, because we're opening a whole kind of worms, and I think it's actually an interesting it's an interesting illustration of the broader sort of critique of the modern world that I think we're getting at here, which is this concept that we have power and we can do great things with it, but without knowledge of ourselves, we don't realize the costs of what we're doing. When culture changes so fast, it's hard to remember what's lost. My father grew up before electricity. He lived at the end of a dirt road, right, on a farm that his grandfather had homesteaded in the Skagit Valley. So he grew up in this super rural situation, and he basically didn't have TV, didn't have radio, didn't have video games. And the really interesting thing is when he was in his late 40s, he built a diving board. And he's out there one day, and he bounces on the diving board 3 times, goes up and does a front flip into a dive into the water, clean entry. And I'd never seen him do a flip in my entire life. I was like, where did that come from?
Right.
And so I started kind of quizzing him about his movement, and it's like, oh, it turns out that all the stuff we're doing now with physical culture, like, it wasn't called parkour then, it was just how kids entertain themselves.
Right.
And, I came out with this video recently, the waterfall. There's video of me climbing through this hole in a waterfall up in Bellingham. Mm-hmm. And so I showed it to my dad. I said, oh man, it must have been really scary to climb up through that. We only ever went down. And I didn't even know my dad had ever even been to that place.
Right.
But it goes to this idea that a lot of these cultural things that we're trying to rediscover right now, they've been around, right? But they weren't recognized. My dad didn't think of all of the ways that he played in the woods as an important part of the culture that he needed to pass on to me. And when all of my friends were playing video games and not spending time in the woods, people didn't recognize the value of what was being lost. And this is where like Richard Lou's work becomes really valuable and just helping us wake up to what we are losing.
Yeah, it reminds me of the story of Jim Thorpe, because a lot of pundits declare him to be one of the greatest athletes that ever lived. And he grew up, I think it was in the backwoods of Oklahoma. Yeah. And he rode horses and chopped wood and ran through the woods, and he lived a very natural lifestyle until one day he showed up at the college and decided to try out for the football team, and he excelled, but he didn't have any sophisticated training. It was all natural.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories like that about like Herschel Walker, and there's this idea in the strength and conditioning world for team sports of somebody who's farm boy strong. And I like to think of that now as human strong, because when we take something like a barbell is an incredibly powerful tool to increase the strength of the prime movers in the body really quickly. But to get someone that strong, but people used to get that strong, we're that strong, but through a much more diverse sort of movement practice. And when your hands are only gripping something that's a specific width, then there's all these degrees of strength that are being missed in the grip strength. If you put a barbell on your back, you'll get a bruise across the top of your shoulder. It goes away over time because that tissue adapts. But what's happening to the rest of your body? But if you're baling hay, if you're carrying yokes, if you're doing all these things, you literally are creating, I think, a much more resilient body for any sport.
Right. Yeah, blue collar stuff, farming, all that stuff is good.
Moving like a human being.
Yeah, climbing ladders, digging holes, shoveling snow, all that stuff is worth doing.
Yeah. Costume change.
Yes. Getting a little chilly.
Okay, guys, we're back here with Frank, who's now got a sweater on because it's gotten a little bit cold. Had to take a break, adjust the cameras. So we were talking about kind of how natural movement has made people strong throughout history. One of the things that you've emphasized a lot, that's a big emphasis for me, obviously, is the importance of the natural world in training. So I wanted to kind of get your take on why it's so important that people take on a physical practice, but a physical practice that engages them with the outdoor natural world, not just the urban environment or the indoors environment.
Right. Well, the short answer is that we're built for it. And every detail of our anatomy and our physiology is built for it. And again, going back to the deep time argument, is that, I mean, just the finest detail of our sensitivity, everything is adapted to the natural world. And by going into gyms and indoor environments where everything's plastic and smooth, we're depriving ourselves of sensation. So outdoors is always going to be better. And it feels better too. And it looks better in general. So it's more pleasing to our sensibilities. There's an aesthetic quality that's pleasing to us also. So, and it encourages diversity. You walk on a trail or you run on a trail, every step is slightly different. And even if you run the same trail over and over again, you get seasonal variations and weather variations. And so every time you have to adapt in a slightly new way. So it's by far the best.
Yeah, so it was, obviously I 100% agree. I think there's just an enormous amount of reasons that when we start measuring the difference in adaptation to whether it's cold or dry, or cold or wet, cold or warm, wet or dry, whether, the types of surfaces that our feet are adapting to, phytochemicals coming from the trees.
Right.
There's probably innumerable reasons, but people have known this forever. You can go back to the Taoists and say, study nature, move.
Right.
Traditional movement practices often, Georges Hébert, you need to move outside. You need to develop your rusticity. But one of them that's a personal passion of mine is just the beauty aspect that you talk about. My training is usually these days at the beach at Karki Park or Golden Gardens or Discovery Park in Seattle because they're near my house. And so I walk, I'm in the city and I don't like being in the city. And so I'm on my computer working and not enjoying that. I mean, it's good. I love the work that I do, but it's still sitting at a computer.
Right.
And so every day I walk down into the park. And, as I walk down the park, it's so easy to kind of let go of everything. And so frequently I'll have an animal sighting. So I'll have a bald eagle that'll fly overhead.
Right.
Lately I've been swimming in the ocean at the end of the day. And frequently it's just me on the beach. And the sun is setting and a heron will glide down and just land right next to me. The other day, there were two sea lions playing in the water. And every time I think to myself, you can't get this in the gym.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you've talked about this. I love this idea of biophilic nourishment.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We've talked a lot about how the human body needs movement as a nourishment, but it also needs connection to nature in general.
Right.
So I really wanted to get your kind of description of what is this biophilia and why do we need it?
Well, the word biophilia literally means love of life, and it was made popular by E.O. Wilson, and he described it as the innate tendency for human beings to affiliate with the natural world. And of course, it's not just humans, because every animal will try and seek out a natural environment that suits itself. It nourishes us, I think, in so many ways, but the classic example is light. I mean, that's the synchronizing force. Natural light will synchronize through the master clock, and then all the distributed clocks through our body. Our physiology literally depends on that synchronization that happens ideally every day at dawn. And we miss out on that too much. But biophilia is an interesting idea because I think there's individual variation there. Some people are just like us. We really, really are drawn to nature. And other people seem to take it or leave it. And I'm not sure why that is. Some people don't feel the compelling need to get out as much. And I wonder about that. But there's no getting around what it does for us. I mean, every system in the body depends on that contact.
As far as why some people are more attracted to it, I think there's probably a lot of individual variation, but I also wonder about the role of exposure. Like, I grew up in the woods. You have a beautiful passage in your book about the creek that you used to go to every day. And what I think that it's like that appetite that we have, but if it's shut down, it doesn't develop normally, right? Kids have an appetite for movement, and we put them in a chair and tell them, you can't run here, you can't jump here, you can't dive here, you can't wrestle anywhere. And so we develop a culture of people who view movement as drudgery and don't like it.
Right.
And so I think that's a big part of why so many people are slothful. It's not that they couldn't have a love for movement. It's that they're stuck in a place where they can't. And I think the same thing is probably true to some degree, that people are really intimidated by nature and they're overwhelmed by it. When I take people out to train in the woods, a lot of people are surprisingly intimidated just by having dirt on their hands.
Right.
It's overwhelming to them.
Right. Yeah. But to bridge on that, people now are starting to talk about the flip side of biophilia, which is biophobia. And college students now, some of them report being either apathetic toward nature or they just don't want to have anything to do with it. And other people overreact to the so-called dangers of being outdoors. I was going up a local trail here just yesterday, and I was only up a few hundred yards from the parking lot, met a woman, and she had one of these bear defense canisters ready to take on the bears. And you're lucky to see one bear here a year, and you're lucky if you see one. So people are frightened, and it probably just comes from the fact that they never got to know the outdoors.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's a really good point of how frightened we are in general of things.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to touch on that. I'm going to just check the cameras one more time.
Okay.
So good on this camera. This camera died.
How long will those cards go for?
I I totally meant to start.
I didn't check, yeah.
So this idea of risk that you talked about, people are afraid of the risk inherent in a natural environment, is a really interesting aspect of movement culture in general. Because people see what I do, and they say, "Oh, you're going to get hurt," or "Oh, someone's going to get hurt." You know, don't climb. Like the reason that we tell kids not to climb trees is because they'll get hurt. The reason that they're not allowed to wrestle is because they'll get hurt. But we're essentially telling them to just stop acting like a human being.
Right. And
there's a risk involved in not being a human being, which is that you're less happy and less competent and less capable in the world. So it's another one of these interesting mismatches, because we've created a world that's safer than we've ever had. And so we're almost become allergic to risk in the same sense that we're supposed to have an immune system that's calibrated on microbes in the soil. We're supposed to have a perception of risk that's calibrated through actually having experienced some.
Right, and all you got to do is think about ancestral native populations and how risky that would have been. That was our standard life. I mean, every day was risk. And it wasn't until, 16th century, the maritime industry started to develop insurance policies for the ships that would go out with their cargo. And then insurance, we started to spread the risk around to people. And now we've come to expect that as being normal, but it's not. I mean, being an animal on this earth is risky, and it always has been. And we gain power by engaging with that risk.
Yeah, we insulating yourself from risk makes you more vulnerable to it in the long run.
Yes.
Biting off just enough risk over and over again is what makes you actually robust to it.
Right.
I think we're done on that card.
Okay.
So, one question I wanted to really dig into before we're done here is this question that I'm really interested in of how to train a human like a human being. You've talked about the idea in your book that we sort of have the wrong model of how we're training. We're training like herbivores.
Right. Oh, right.
And I've thought about this as this idea of kind of an imbalance between the savanna adaptation of a human being and the jungle adaptation of a human being. So if we look at a savanna environment or an arid environment, the ability to traverse a long distance becomes really important. And there's less obstacles that you have to deal with in an environment. If you look at a jungle, on the other hand, the obstacle is the thing, right? Like you're always struggling to get over things. And you can look at the populations that come from these and see very different physical adaptations, very different cultural traditions. And we have a culture right now that, for most people, really prizes how far can you go,
right?
And not so much how complex can you handle. And I think that's it's an imbalance, and I'm just curious for your thoughts on that and how you've seen that develop for, seeing the aerobics thing come and go, and now there's movement culture, now there's parkour. How do you see that balance coming out?
Yeah, well, after reading Chris McDougall's book, Born to Run, I felt like he painted kind of a unbalanced picture of human evolution, because for him, it's all about long distance running, chasing down animals, and that being the standard in human evolution. And I don't doubt that happened probably a lot. And I'm sure that every tribe had certain hunters that were capable of these long distance aerobic feats. But is that the standard? Well, I don't think so, because there was also a lot of walking and gathering and opportunistic hunting and dealing with different kinds of terrain. And we focus, I think, in the modern world, we focus on aerobic exercise because it's easy to test, it's easy to measure. And it's really easy to do. John Rady, in his book Spark, he talks about the fact that it's really easy to do laboratory tests on rats because you can get them to run on a running wheel and mimic aerobic exercise, and then you can collect all this data, and then you can point to the values of aerobic exercise. And so I think the exercise culture is really skewed now towards aerobic endurance, monotonous exercise, because we've studied it a lot. And I think what's going to happen is we're going to find similar benefits to every kind of movement that we do. But the complexity that you speak of in an arboreal environment, I think that's huge. And it's bound to have good cognitive payoffs and good psychological payoffs, just because it's so fun to move in 3 planes at once rather than that single plane movement. And there's something, I'm sure that there's a link between the kinds of movement we do and the cognition that we have and the kind of ideas that we produce. And I think we value aerobic exercise because it produces certain kinds of cognition. And it really ties into corporate culture, where there's really a strong value placed on endurance and perseverance, persistence. But what about dance? What about moving in a 3-dimensional environment? That kind of physical experience is bound to make us more creative. So training the human animal, training people like people, humans like humans, I think you've got to do all of the above.
Yeah.
And let people have that diversity of experience. And that's the beauty of going outside, because you get a lot of that. Mm-hmm. Machines are inherently monotonous. Yeah. Even the best machines, best exercise machines, you figure them out pretty fast.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think even, a lot of this kind of up and coming movement culture, a lot of people are doing most of it on flat ground. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of patterns, quadrupedal movement that's on flat ground. Within the parkour community, it's a lot of flat surfaces, even if there's variations in them. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of flat surfaces. And I think that there's really a lot that's missed there. As soon as you get into a tree and you have so many dimensions of movement to have to kind of process, I really do think that it is better cognitive food.
Right.
There's an author, Tracy Alloway, a researcher, who did a study recently on tree climbing and found that it has pretty profound effects on working memory.
Right.
It'd be really interesting to see if we can get some corroboration of that over time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I completely agree that, we've overemphasized aerobics because of the ability to measure them. And then really in the same sense, something like bodybuilding, it's easy to measure a change in muscular size.
Right.
It's much more difficult to measure a change in movement quality or a change in cognitive state due to movement.
Right.
But I think that we're definitely seeing a turnaround there. And I hope though that, it's interesting because science is so powerful. I love science, but if I look back at the history of science and I see all the times when science led us down this road that people just jump way too far with, and then their justification for jumping to the next thing is more science.
Right.
I mean, science is the best and most robust tool for creating knowledge that there ever has been, but I think that there's a tendency to look at any scientific result as the truth rather than as a specific set of information that's very limited based on the context of the way that the study was created.
Right, exactly. And I feel the same way. I love science, but science is a brand new thing. And if you look at human history, 99.99% of human history, knowledge was gained through experience. And that worked for us. And we can rely on that.
And we have traditions of dance, traditions of martial arts, traditions of movement that are thousands of years old.
Right.
And if we start cross-comparing them, if we look at European martial arts traditions and Japanese and Chinese martial arts tradition, we find a lot of the same things. We find that they lifted heavy things in order to become stronger to apply to the sport.
Right.
Back to Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, talking about this. We find that, they practiced acrobatics.
Right.
They practiced break falls.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that's being sort of rediscovered right now as part of movement culture. It's not that new.
Right.
But when we become so dependent on trying to justify things off of the newest thing, instead of looking at that long body history,
right,
I think that it results in bigger pendulum swings away from kind of the mean of the right practice.
Right. Yeah, so many of us are trying to be professional, and to be professional means to be scientific and to measure everything, but it's not always necessary. And you can be a professional and put the emphasis on experience. Mm-hmm. That's a perfectly valid way to go, because the body has plenty of capability to learn the world without scientific measurement. It doesn't have to happen.
I had a profound moment of learning with that, where I really based the development of the curriculum at Parkour Visions, which is the parkour gym that I started, on the best science that I could find. And it was all about, how do I create progressions that are going to allow people to attain skills as quickly as possible. And one of our coaches was a brilliant young woman, Brandy Laird. She was more resistant than a lot of our coaches to kind of the dictates that I put out. And we negotiated a kind of a solution where she was able to coach, and it was enough like what I wanted, and she was doing her thing, and she was satisfied. And over time, she started attracting really big crowds to her classes. And people who came out of her classes were like, Brandy's classes are magic, they're amazing. And so I was like, okay, I've been giving everyone the curriculum. Now I'm going to start harvesting the strength of the other coaches. So I sat down with Brandy and asked, what is the secret? Why do people think your classes are magic? And essentially what she told me was that I viewed coaching as a science, and she viewed it as a performance art. Mm. And that her whole goal with a class was less to create the optimal progression within that class, and more to create a profound experience that would be highly rewarding for the individual, so that they want to continue, because they would progress if they kept doing it. Mm-hmm. And they would keep doing it if it was really rewarding. Mm-hmm. And I think that's just a profound kind of lesson for all of physical culture to take, is that those of us who are teachers, to be able to focus on the story that we're telling and the experience that we're giving. Right. And for those of us who are practitioners, to let that be part of it too. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not just about knocking off these goals, it's about telling yourself this great story. If you have a great story about why you're training, you're a lot more likely to keep doing it. Yeah. Brandy's the head coach at Parkour Visions now. She's awesome. So if you guys get a chance, go say hi to her.
Well, her suggestion around art, I think, is extremely powerful, because for me, the starting point so often is mismatch. And I say, here we are, these Aboriginal bodies in this modern world, we've got this problem, and what's the solution to mismatch? If you look for one solution, it's pretty tough. I mean, there's so many different people in so many different circumstances. How do you come up with one solution for mismatch? You can't. But if you put the emphasis on art and creativity, now maybe you can come up with 7 billion workable solutions to mismatch. And that, I think, is a way forward, because we're all groping for that. Lifestyle disease, trying to find a workable lifestyle in this mismatched environment, that demands creativity. And that's where the movement teachers come in and say, we can help you with that. We can help you be more creative in the way that you move, but also in the way that you live and the way that you adapt to mismatch. Yeah. So we provide a very valuable service to the world right now.
That's great. I think that's a good place to kind of close our conversation for the day.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Frank.
Thank you
guys for paying attention. It was a wonderful chance to converse with you, and I hope that people really can take some great lessons from it. I thought it was awesome.
Thank you so much.